By 1600, the old world was teetering on the brink of collapse. The Spanish model of absolute monarchy and plundered gold had hit a systemic wall. It was a single point of failure that had crumbled under its own weight. But while the powerful Habsburgs were defaulting on their debts, a tiny nation of water engineers was busy rewriting the very source code of power. They realized that a nation's true strength isn't found in a mountain of gold, but in the collective capital of its citizens. This is the story of one of the greatest systemic upgrades in human history, the birth of the VOC, the Dutch East India Company. We're witnessing a monumental shift, moving away from the king's debt and toward the shareholders' profit. The era of the individual merchant is ending. The era of the corporation is here. We are following the money into the world's first stock market, where power moved from the crown to the crowd. Before 1602, sea voyages were one-off gambles. A merchant would buy a ship, sail it, and if it returned, he was rich. If it sank, he was ruined. This was high-risk individualism. The Dutch upgraded this into fractional ownership. They created the Verenigde the VOC. Instead of one man owning one ship, thousands of citizens could own a piece of the entire fleet. This was the first public offering. By pooling the small savings of thousands, from wealthy mayors to common kitchen maids, the Dutch created a pool of capital that was deeper and more stable than the King of Spain's treasury. They were crowdsourcing a superpower. This might look like just a piece of paper, but this illustration isn't just that of any document. It's the world's very first share certificate from the Dutch East India Company, or VOC. Before this, going into business was a huge gamble. If things went south, you could lose everything you owned. But the VOC introduced a game-changing idea: limited liability. This meant you only risked the money you actually invested. Suddenly, anyone could become a stakeholder in the country's biggest ventures. Wealth was no longer just for the rich or powerful. It became something you could participate in creating. This was the birth of public equity, a revolutionary system where a company's success was shared by the people. It created a powerful cycle of investment that fueled an entire golden age. This single piece of paper literally changed the world of finance forever. With shares being traded, a new secondary market emerged, the stock exchange. The Amsterdam Bourse became the world's first financial command center. Here, the value of the VOC wasn't dictated by a king. It was discovered by the market. This was real-time price discovery. If a ship was delayed, the price dropped. If a new spice island was found, it skyrocketed. This provided a transparency that the Spanish Empire lacked. The VOC was a data-driven entity. Every piece of news from the East was converted into a financial signal, allowing the Dutch to move their capital with a precision and speed that no monarchy could match. The VOC wasn't just a trading company. It was a state within a state. The Dutch government granted it a 21-year monopoly, and crucially, the power to build forts, maintain an army, and sign treaties. This was corporate sovereignty. The VOC was the first entity to outsource the costs of empire to a private balance sheet. While the Spanish king had to pay for his wars out of taxes, the VOC paid for its expansion out of profits. It was a self-funding military-industrial complex. This allowed the Dutch to wage a permanent global war against their rivals without ever going bankrupt. They had turned the concept of empire into a profitable business model. This Dutch giant was the world's first multinational corporation, and it dominated trade across the globe. The target wasn't gold or silver, but something far more valuable in the 17th century: spices. Think of nutmeg, cloves and mace as the high-value data of their time. The Dutch East India Company, or VOC, didn't just trade these spices, they secured them. By 1621, they had a near-total monopoly. They realized a simple truth: if you control the source, you control the price. This was a masterclass in vertical integration, controlling everything from the spice farms in the East Indies all the way to the dinner tables of Europe. This iron grip on the market provided a steady, reliable income, allowing the VOC to pay out massive dividends, sometimes as high as 40%. This kept shareholders loyal and attracted even more investment, creating a cycle of power and profit that changed the world forever. Never seen before in the history of the world, an entire nation got rich, seemingly overnight. A family in the 17th century Netherlands, not royalty, but ordinary people, could be gazing at a piece of paper. This was a share in the VOC, the Dutch East India Company. It wasn't just for the wealthy. Even small shopkeepers could put their coins into a collection box, investing in the future. This single innovation created a new kind of social stability. Suddenly, the success of a massive corporation was directly tied to the success of its citizens. This was the world's first stakeholder economy. While Spain's gold stayed with the elite, the VOC's profits, its dividends, flowed down to the people. This cash injection fueled a consumer revolution. It's why we see this explosion of Dutch art from masters like Vermeer and Rembrandt. They were commissioned by a new, wealthy middle class whose prosperity was built on public investment. This systemic upgrade rewarded thrift, planning, and shared success, changing the world forever. To support this massive trade, the Dutch created the Bank of Amsterdam, the first true central bank prototype. They offered the world's standardized money. In a time of devalued Spanish coins and varying currencies, the Dutch bank offered bank money that was 100% backed by gold and silver reserves. This was total transparency. Amsterdam became the world's safety deposit box. Foreign kings and merchants kept their gold in Amsterdam because it was safer there than in their own treasuries. This liquidity hub meant the Dutch always had access to the cheapest credit in the world. They were the bankers of Europe, and their low interest rates allowed them to outinvest any rival. The VOC was a logistics machine. They managed thousands of employees across 10 different time zones. To do this, they perfected managerial accounting. They were the first to treat information as an asset. They had to know exactly how much pepper was in a warehouse in Java, and how much it would be worth in Amsterdam 6 months later. This data sync allowed them to optimize their supply chain, reducing waste and maximizing throughput. They weren't just merchants. They were system integrators. They were moving from intuitive trade to algorithmic trade, where every decision was backed by a report and every report was backed by a ledger. How did this tiny nation, the Netherlands, build a successful global empire? The secret wasn't just ships or spices, it was people. The Dutch East India Company, or VOC, had a game-changing advantage: human capital. Unlike other powers that appointed nobles with zero experience, the VOC invested in long-term professionalization. They built navigation schools, set up standardized medical care for their sailors, and, most importantly, created a career path based on merit, not birth. This meant a humble cabin boy could genuinely rise through the ranks to become a Governor General. This meritocratic ladder ensured that the VOC was always run by the most skilled and capable managers. While Spanish fleets were led by clueless aristocrats, Dutch fleets were commanded by seasoned professionals. This focus on talent created a skill monopoly that allowed 2 million people to dominate world trade for centuries. The profits of the VOC funded the scientific revolution in the north. But this wasn't curiosity. It was applied science. The Dutch needed better lenses for telescopes, better math for insurance, and better biology to prevent scurvy. Science was the research and development department of the corporation. Every discovery was a systemic optimization. They were turning the profits of the spice trade into a knowledge advantage. They realized that technology was the ultimate lever. The more advanced your tools, the less gold you needed to achieve the same result. The Dutch pivot was the moment science and capital officially formed a permanent alliance to run the world. Ever heard of a company that was basically its own country? This could be said about the Dutch East India Company, or the VOC. Imagine this, a single company with its own army, its own navy, and the power to wage war. For nearly 200 years, they were a global superpower. They weren't just trading, they were conquering. With documents called letters of marque, they could legally act as pirates, seizing ships and treasure. From massive forts along the African coast to controlling vital ports all across Asia, their influence was immense. The VOC could mint its own coins, negotiate treaties, and even establish colonies. They were the world's first multinational corporation, and their story is a wild ride of ambition, power, and wealth that literally changed the map of the world. But the system wasn't perfect. The high liquidity of the Amsterdam market led to the world's first asset bubble, tulip mania, in 1637. Because the Dutch had so much investable capital and so few assets to put it in, they began speculating on the price of exotic tulip bulbs. It was a systemic stress test. The bubble burst, but the Dutch software survived. Unlike Spain, which collapsed after a default, the Dutch had a resilient infrastructure. The stock exchange and the Bank of Amsterdam remained intact. They learned a vital forensic lesson: markets need regulation and collateral. They didn't abandon the system, they patched it, making it stronger for the next century of growth. How could a tiny country like the Netherlands rule the world's economy? It wasn't just about tulips and windmills. Back in the 1650s, the Dutch cracked a code that gave them an unstoppable advantage. They became the world's bankers. While their rivals in England and France were paying hefty interest rates of 10 or 12%, the Dutch were borrowing money for as low as 3%. Think about that. This massive difference in the cost of capital was their superpower. It meant they could outborrow and outinvest everyone. They could fund bigger fleets, longer voyages, and more ambitious projects, all while their competitors struggled to keep up. This wasn't just about business, it was about power. The Dutch realized they didn't need to conquer countries with armies when they could control them with debt. They were pioneering a new form of global dominance, financial hegemony. It was the dawn of a new world order, proving that whoever controls the interest rate ultimately controls the future. To protect their global interests, the Dutch upgraded international law. Hugo Grotius, a VOC lawyer, developed the concept of mare liberum, the free seas. He argued that the ocean was international property. This wasn't idealism, it was legal infrastructure for the VOC to sail anywhere. They were creating a global legal framework that favored trade over territory. This was a move from might is right to contract is right. By defining the rules of global interaction, the Dutch ensured that their logistics protocol would always be protected by the law, creating the level playing field that modern international trade still relies upon today. In Amsterdam, the Dutch invented short selling and options trading. They were the first to realize that you can profit from the future price of an asset, even if you don't own it. This was speculative finance in its purest form. It allowed for risk hedging, but it also introduced market manipulation. The Dutch were the first to experience the volatility of a public market. They had to learn how to manage systemic risk, the danger that one bad actor could crash the entire exchange. This led to the first financial regulations and disclosure requirements, turning the stock market into a governed ecosystem and not a lawless, gambling hall. The hidden history of the Dutch pivot is the democratization of knowledge. Because every citizen was an investor, everyone needed to understand geography and global events. The Dutch were the most globalized population in history. They weren't subjects of a king, they were citizens of a market. This informed agency is what allowed for the growth of representative government. If you have a stake in the company, you want a say in how it's run. The Dutch Republic was the first political systemic upgrade that mirrored the corporate upgrade. The nation was being run like a board of directors, where the shareholders, the citizens, had the final word. Finally, we see the transition to human capital. The Dutch realized that their tiny land couldn't compete on volume, so they competed on value add. They became the refiners of Europe. They imported raw sugar, tobacco, and cocoa and upgraded them into high-value consumer products. This value chain positioning is what made them so rich. They weren't just extractors, they were optimizers. This required a highly educated, highly mobile workforce. The freedom to work and freedom to invent were the core plugins of the Dutch system. They were proving that a nation's most valuable natural resource is the creativity and agency of its people, backed by a stable financial system. Ever wonder where our modern financial world came from? Think about checking a stock price, buying a share, or even working for a big company. All of these concepts trace back to a single moment in history, the Dutch pivot of 1602. This was the moment Amsterdam created the operating system for the world we live in today. The Dutch proved that public capital money from everyday people investing together was far more powerful than a king's royal gold. They invented the corporation, the most efficient machine ever designed for organizing human effort and taking it global. The first great corporation, the Dutch East India Company, eventually faded away, but its source code was copied by everyone, most notably the English. This systemic upgrade went universal. The old world, run by kings, was replaced by a new one, run by corporate networks. The world was now publicly traded, and there was no going back. As the Dutch Golden Age reached its limit, the money trail was already moving across the Channel to London. The British were about to take the corporate model and apply it to an even larger, more dangerous scale. They were about to discover that the public market can be used for more than just trade. It can be used for the greatest financial heist in history. In our next episode, we perform an audit of the South Sea bubble, where the system itself became the weapon. The receipts are moving to the London coffee houses. This is the hidden history. Next time, the South Sea heist. Follow the money into the first global market crash. This company was so rich it makes Apple and Google look like small startups. The Dutch East India Company, or VOC. Back in the 17th century, this wasn't just a company. It was a global empire. At its peak, the VOC was worth an insane $78 trillion in today's money. That's more than the GDP of Japan, Germany, and the UK combined. A small group of elite families, the Heeren XVII, ran the show. They had their own army, printed their own money, and even waged wars. They controlled the spice trade with an iron fist, making themselves unbelievably wealthy. But like all great empires, it couldn't last forever. Greed and corruption rotted it from the inside out. Officials started their own private businesses, smuggling goods and lining their own pockets. The once mighty giant crumbled under its own weight. But the VOC wasn't the only bubble of its time. I'm Edward Turfall, and this was the Dutch Pivot. Subscribe and follow the money into episode 6, where the British take the corporate model and turn it into the greatest financial heist in history. The South Sea bubble. The receipts are moving to London.